The wind in Dry Creek was a thief. It stole the moisture from the earth, leaving behind a jigsaw of cracks wide enough to swallow a man's hope. It stole the warmth from a body, even on a sun-scorched afternoon. And it stole the words from a person's mouth, whipping them away with a gritty hiss before they could ever be properly heard. The town itself was little more than a collection of weary, sun-bleached buildings huddled along a single dusty street, all of them leaning as if tired of fighting the relentless push of the plains. Above, the sky was a vast, unforgiving expanse of pale blue, and the canyon walls in the distance threw back the lonely sound of a shod horse on stone, an echo that made the emptiness feel bigger, not smaller. This was the world Clara Monroe inhabited, a world that had shrunk to the four walls of her small, rough-hewn cabin on the edge of town. Her days were measured by the rhythmic push and pull of a needle through coarse fabric. She was a mender, a fixer of things others had worn out. Her fingers, though calloused, were nimble, her stitches small and even. It was honest work, quiet work, and it was barely enough to keep food on her table. Today, the work lay untouched in her sewing basket. Her hands were clenched in her lap, not to still a tremor, but to keep them from flying to her face to hide her shame. The accusation had come like a rattler striking from the dust. It happened at the Mercantile, the heart of Dry Creek, a place that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and the sharp tang of gossip. Mr. Silas Tate, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest and whose face was perpetually flushed with self-importance, had declared $20 missing from his cash box. His gaze, small and hard as pebbles, had landed on Clara. She had been the only other person in the store that morning, trading a neatly patched shirt for a small sack of flour and a few potatoes. Now, the town had turned on her. It was not just the theft, it was her. Clara was a widow. And in a town like Dry Creek, a woman alone was a puzzle that people solved with suspicion. She was a loose thread in the tightly woven fabric of their community, and they were all too eager to snip her off. The whispers had started the day she'd buried her husband. Thomas. He'd been a good man, a strong man, until the mountain took him in a mine collapse. The whispers said she'd been a drain on him, that her frailness had driven him to work the most dangerous seams. A woman like that brings a man bad luck. They murmured behind their hands at the church social. He was never the same after he married her. The whispers followed her down the dusty street, clinging to the back of her worn calico dress like burrs. Now, those same whispers had grown teeth. It was only a matter of time. A woman with no man to guide her is bound to fall into sin. The law in Dry Creek was a simple affair, embodied by Sheriff Holt, a man whose wisdom was as vast and craggy as the landscape. But Sheriff Holt was gone, ridden out 2 days prior to deal with a cattle dispute over in the next county, and he was not expected back before the end of the week. In his absence, the town's authority rested on the shoulders of his deputy, Eli Ward. Eli was not a natural lawman. He had the build of a man who'd spent more time breaking horses than breaking up fights. His hands were broad and scarred, his shoulders wide from a life of hard labor on a ranch. He had taken the deputy's star a year ago, not out of ambition, but out of a need for penance. A violent night, too much whiskey, and a dispute over a card game had left another man dead in the dust outside the saloon. It had been ruled self-defense, but the town had a long memory. They had watched him, judged him, and Eli had accepted their silent condemnation. He wore the star like a shield, a way to prove he was more than the sum of his worst moment. He kept his head down, his words few, and enforced the law with a quiet, unyielding firmness that most men respected and all men understood. He was trying to build a new man out of the ashes of the old one. He found Clara standing outside her cabin, a lone, still figure against the backdrop of the endless, wind-swept plains. The door to her home was ajar, a silent invitation to the dust that swirled at her feet. She was not crying. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a fear so deep it looked like exhaustion. In her hands, She clutched her sewing basket as if it were the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving around her. The needle, thread, and worn thimble inside were the tools of her honest life, and she held them now like a prayer book. "Mrs. Monroe," Eli said, his voice low and rough, not unkind. He stopped a few feet from her, his shadow falling long over the cracked earth. She looked up at him, and, for a moment, he saw the full force of her desolation. Her eyes were the color of a dove's wing, a soft, wounded gray. "Deputy Ward." Mr. Tate came to my office," he began, hating the words before they were even out of his mouth. "He's making an accusation about some missing money." Clara flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders. "I did not take his money." Her voice was a thread, thin and strained, but it did not break. Eli looked past her at the desolate landscape, then back at the faces of the small group of townspeople who had followed him, their curiosity a palpable, ugly thing. Mrs. Tate was there, her arms crossed, her face a mask of smug certainty. He saw the judgment in their eyes, the same judgment he had seen directed at himself a year ago. He knew how it felt to be tried and convicted by whispers. A part of him, the part that remembered the taste of dirt and shame, wanted to tell them all to go to hell, to leave the woman alone. But the star on his chest was heavy. It was a promise he had made. "I know," he said, and the words surprised him. He had not meant to say them. He cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "I mean, it's not for me to decide. That's the judge's business. He's due to ride through in a couple of days. Until then, I have to take you in." Her gaze did not waver. She seemed to be looking right through the badge, into the man beneath it. "Take me in," she repeated softly, the words catching on the wind. "To the jail?" "It's for your own safety, ma'am," he said, the official line sounding hollow and false even to his own ears. He could see the tremor starting in her hands now, a fine shaking that made the wicker of her sewing basket creak. He felt a muscle twitch in his cheek. This was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, a deep, discordant note that told him he was on the wrong side of this. But the law was the law. It was the rigid structure he had chained himself to, the one thing that kept his own past at bay. "My safety?" she whispered, a ghost of a bitter laugh in her voice. "From what, deputy? From the whispers?" He had no answer for that. He just held out a hand, not to touch her, but as a gesture, a reluctant command. "Please, Mrs. Monroe, let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she nodded. She did not look at the watching eyes of the townsfolk as he led her away. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground in front of her, her worn boots scuffing up little puffs of dust with each step. He walked beside her, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol out of habit, feeling the weight of every stair they passed. He was the law, leading a thief to justice, but all he felt like was a bully, leading a frightened bird to a cage. The jail was a small, solid building made of thick stone blocks, built to withstand more than just the weather. It was the coldest place in Dry Creek, even in the height of summer. Inside, the main office was sparse, a desk, a chair, a gun rack, and a pot-bellied stove that stood cold and silent. A single doorway led to the back, to the cell. The cell was a dim, cramped space, no bigger than a pantry. It held a narrow cot with a thin, striped mattress, a bucket in the corner, and nothing else. A single, high window, barred and thick with grime, let in a sliver of gray light. The air was heavy with the smell of damp stone, iron, and the faint, lingering despair of the men who had been confined there before. Eli held the door open, the heavy iron bars casting long shadows across the floor. Clara stopped at the threshold, her shoulders slumping. She looked into the gloom, then back at him, her eyes pleading. For a moment, he hesitated. He could still turn back, Tell Tate he would investigate further, that there was no proof. But the town was watching. His own fragile authority was on the line. She stepped inside without another word. Moving to the cot and sitting on its edge, she placed her sewing basket beside her, a small, pathetic monument to her former life. She did not look at him as he closed the barred door. The sound of the heavy bolt sliding into place was brutally loud in the stillness. It was a sound of finality, a sound that separated her world from his. He fumbled with the large iron key, its cold weight unfamiliar in his hand. He had never locked a woman in this cell before. He had never locked up anyone he believed might be innocent. The key turned in the lock with a grating screech. "It's only until the judge rides through," he said again, his voice echoing slightly in the stone room. 2 days at most." She finally looked up at him, her face a pale oval in the dim light. 2 days, she repeated, her voice flat, devoid of hope. He lingered for a moment, standing on the other side of the bars, feeling like a fool and a tyrant. He wanted to say something more, something to ease the stark terror he saw in her eyes. But the words would not come. He was a lawman, and she was his prisoner. There was nothing more to be said. He turned and walked back into his office, leaving her alone in the deepening shadows. As the sun began its slow descent, bleeding orange and purple across the horizon, the air grew thick and heavy. The wind died down, and a strange, oppressive stillness fell over Dry Creek. The sky to the west was turning the color of a bruise. A storm was coming. Eli could smell it in the air, the scent of rain on dry earth, the electric charge that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He lit the lantern on his desk, its yellow glow pushing back the encroaching darkness but doing little to warm the chill in the office. He could not bring himself to sit down. He paced the worn floorboards, the jingle of his spurs a restless counterpoint to the growing silence. Every few steps, his route took him past the doorway to the cell, and he could see her, a still shape on the cot, her back to him. The first clap of thunder was a distant rumble, a low growl from the belly of the mountains. Then came the rain, not a gentle shower, but a sudden, violent deluge, hammering against the tin roof of the jailhouse like 1,000 tiny fists. The sound was deafening, isolating them completely from the outside world. The dusty street would be a river of mud by now. The world outside their stone walls had ceased to exist. Hours passed. The storm raged, a wild and furious thing. Lightning flashed, momentarily illuminating the cell in a stark, blue-white glare, freezing Clara's rigid posture in his memory before plunging her back into darkness. Eli sat at his desk, staring at a week-old wanted poster, the words blurring before his eyes. He could not shake the image of her face, the quiet dignity that had crumbled into raw fear. He thought of the sewing basket on the floor beside her cot, a symbol of a life so small and fragile that $20 seemed like a fortune. It did not make sense. The silence from the cell was more unnerving than tears would have been. He could hear the rain, the thunder, the frantic beating of his own heart, but from her, there was nothing. Finally, he could bear it no longer. He stood up and walked to the cell door, his boots echoing on the stone floor. She was still sitting on the cot, but she had turned to face him. In the flickering lamplight that reached her from the office, her eyes seemed huge and dark. "Are you all right, Mrs. Monroe?" he asked, his voice strained. She did not answer his question. Instead, she asked one of her own, her voice barely a whisper above the drumming of the rain. "Deputy?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you believe I did it?" The question was simple, direct, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was the one question he had been asking himself all afternoon. He looked at her, at the honest weariness etched around her eyes, at the way her hands were knotted together in her lap, a tangle of fear and pride. He thought of Silas Tate's blustering certainty and the town's cruel, easy judgment. He thought of his own past, of how quickly a life could be ruined by a single accusation, true or not. He opened his mouth to give her the lawman's answer, that it was not his place to believe anything, that the facts would speak for themselves. But the words caught in his throat. He could not lie to her, and he could not speak the truth, that he did not believe she was a thief, that he saw in her a loneliness that mirrored his own. To admit that would be to cross a line, to betray the badge he wore. So he said nothing. He simply stood there, gripping the cold iron bars, the storm raging outside and a different kind of storm building within the stone walls of the jail. Through the bars, their eyes met and held. The space between them was charged, filled with everything that had not been said. He saw her fear, her exhaustion, her desperate plea for someone, anyone, to believe in her. And in his gaze, she saw something that startled her, not the cold certainty of a lawman, but the deep, troubled doubt of a man. It was a look that was both wary and raw, a silent acknowledgement of the cage they were both in, one made of iron and stone, the other of duty and the past. And in that shared, unspoken moment, as the thunder cracked overhead, they were no longer just a prisoner and her guard. They were a man and a woman, trapped together on a small, lonely island in the heart of a storm. Dawn broke not with light, but with a deeper shade of gray. The thunder had retreated into a sullen, distant muttering, but the rain had not ceased. It fell now with a heavy, soaking persistence, turning the world outside the jailhouse into a brown, churning soup. The single street of Dry Creek was gone, swallowed by a muddy torrent that gushed and eddied around the foundations of the buildings. The sound was no longer the sharp drumming of the previous night, but a thick, relentless hiss, the sound of a world slowly drowning. Eli had not slept. He had spent the night in his chair, listening to the storm and the profound silence from the cell. He rose with the grim morning light, his bones aching with a weariness that had little to do with being awake. A glance out the window confirmed his fears. Dry Creek was an island. The small wooden bridge that spanned the gully at the edge of town would be gone, its timbers likely halfway to the next territory by now. The road was impassable. There would be no judge today, nor tomorrow. The realization settled in his gut like a cold stone. He was trapped here with her. His promise of 2 days had been a lie, washed away with the road. He had to tell her. He made coffee, the familiar ritual a small comfort in the unsettling morning. The smell of the grounds and the hiss of the water were normal things in a world that felt anything but. He found a tin of beans in the supply cupboard, left over from Sheriff Holt's last trip. He heated them on the small stove, the metallic tang mixing with the aroma of the coffee. He sliced 2 thick pieces from a loaf of bread, placing it all on a tin plate. It was prisoner's food, plain and grim, but it was all he had. When he approached the cell, she was awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked as if she had not moved all night. Her face was pale in the watery light, her eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Morning," he said, his voice rough. He knelt and slid the plate of food through the small gap at the bottom of the bars. "The road's washed out. The bridge is gone. The judge won't be able to get through for a few days. Maybe longer." She looked down at the plate, then back up at him. She did not seem surprised, only resigned. "I see. I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, and he meant it. "I'll send word as soon as the water goes down." She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He expected her to eat, but she just stared at the plate. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the rain. "You should eat something," he prodded gently. "I'm not hungry," she replied, her voice low. He remained there, kneeling on the cold stone floor. A lawman on the wrong side of the bars. He should have stood up, gone back to his desk, left her to her misery. But he did not. "It's a bad storm," he said, for lack of anything better to say. "My husband, Thomas, he hated storms," she said, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear it. "He worked in the silver mine, up on the mountain." He said the thunder sounded like the rock groaning, right before a collapse. He always said he'd rather face a blizzard than a thunderstorm. Eli stayed quiet, listening. This was the first time she had spoken of anything beyond her immediate plight. "He died in a collapse," she continued, her gaze distant, fixed on a memory he could not see. There was no storm that day. The sun was shining. The foreman said it was just a weak timber, a pocket of bad rock. They brought him out. They brought all of them out. But Thomas was gone. It was so quiet that day. I remember the silence more than the crying. She finally picked up the piece of bread, turning it over and over in her fingers. "We came here thinking we'd make a life. He was a good miner, strong. He promised me a house with a real glass window and a porch swing. He said I would not have to work another day in my life once the silver came in." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a quick, angry gesture. After he was gone, there was nothing. The mining company gave the widows $10 each, $10 for a husband. The women with families, with sons old enough to work, they managed, but I was alone. She looked at Eli then, her eyes clear and direct, holding a pain so profound it made him want to look away. "This town is not kind to a woman by herself. Deputy, to them. I was not a grieving widow. I was a burden, a problem. When I tried to get work cleaning at the saloon, the owner's wife told everyone I was a woman of loose morals. When I offered to help with the laundry, the other women would stop talking when I came near. It was easier to pretend I was invisible." She took a small bite of the bread, chewing it slowly, mechanically. "So I took up mending. It was the only thing no one could take from me, the only thing they could not poison with their gossip. I can make an old shirt last another year. I can patch a pair of trousers so you can barely see the seam. It is honest work. It is all I have." Eli listened, and with every word she spoke, the guilt inside him grew. He knew these people. He knew their harsh, unbending brand of frontier piety. He had been on the receiving end of their silent judgment himself. They had forgiven him his sin, or at least buried it, because he was a man, and he had taken up a badge that served their interests. But for a woman like Clara, there was no forgiveness. There was only suspicion. He thought of his own past, a memory he kept locked away in a darker cell than this one. It had been in a saloon, much like the one she mentioned. The air had been thick with sweat and cheap whiskey, a game of cards, a boastful word, an accusation of cheating. He had been younger then, full of a wild, restless anger he did not understand. The other man, a freight driver named Miller, had been loud and drunk. Eli remembered the shove, the flash of red anger, the sickening weight of a bottle in his hand, the crack as it struck bone, and the man falling. He remembered standing over the body, the whiskey souring in his stomach, and the silence that had descended on the room, a silence that had followed him ever since. No one spoke of it now. They called it self-defense, but Eli knew. He knew that in that moment. He had wanted to hurt the man. He had let the beast inside him off its chain. He wore the star on his chest to keep that beast caged. Hearing Clara's story, her quiet suffering under the town's cruel gaze, made him feel the rattle of its bars. As she spoke, he began to re-examine the accusation against her. He replayed Silas Tate's story in his mind. Tate had been adamant, sputtering with indignation. "The money was in the box right before I closed for supper. I counted it myself. She was the last one in here, and when I came back, $20 was gone." But Eli remembered something. He had been walking his rounds just as Tate was locking up. He had seen Tate leave, but a few minutes later, he had seen Martha Tate, Silas's wife, slip out the back door of the mercantile, carrying a basket. He had not thought anything of it at the time. Martha was a nervous woman, always flitting about. But now, what if Silas had not been the last one to touch that cash box? And $20. It was a specific amount. Not the whole till just a portion. It felt less like a desperate theft and more like something else, something personal. He filed the thought away. a seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of his guilt. The day bled away into a long, gray afternoon. Clara ate the beans and the rest of the bread. They spoke more, their conversations circling the edges of their lonely lives. She told him about the farm she grew up on, the smell of hay in the summer and the bite of the winter wind. He told her about breaking horses on a ranch down south, about the freedom of being on the open range with nothing but the sky above him. They were careful words, offerings laid gently across the space that separated them, building a fragile bridge over the chasm of their circumstance. As night fell again, the storm found its second wind. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the corners of the stone building like a grieving animal. Eli lit the lantern, the small flame casting huge, dancing shadows that made the office feel both smaller and more menacing. Clara had grown quiet again, retreating into herself as the darkness deepened. She sat on her cot, her arms wrapped around her knees. After a long while, a sound drifted from the cell, so faint at first that Eli thought he was imagining it. She was humming. It was a simple, sorrowful melody, a church hymn he recognized from a childhood he had long since abandoned. It was a sound of pure, unadorned loneliness, a prayer whispered into the heart of the storm. Eli could not bring himself to move. He sat in his chair by the stove, which he had lit against the damp chill, and listened. The simple tune spoke of a faith and a hope that he had lost long ago. He felt like an intruder, eavesdropping on a conversation between her and her God. He closed his eyes, the melody washing over him, and for the first time in a very long time, the beast inside him was quiet. He must have drifted off. He was woken by a sound that was not thunder. It was a sharp, splitting crack, terrifyingly close, followed by an explosive flash of light that turned the world white for a half-second. The lantern on his desk flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the jail into absolute, suffocating darkness. A sharp, terrified gasp came from the cell. "Mrs. Monroe? Clara!" he called out, his voice loud in the sudden silence that followed the thunderclap. He heard a frantic scrambling sound, the scrape of a boot on stone, and then a small, choked sob. The sound cut through him, sharp and immediate. This was not the quiet sadness of before. This was raw panic. "It is all right," he said, his voice firm, trying to project a calm he did not feel. "The lightning must have struck the old oak out back. I will light the lantern." He fumbled on the desk for the box of matches, his fingers clumsy in the dark. He heard another small cry from the cell, a sound of pure fear. To hell with the lantern. He moved toward the cell door, his hands outstretched, finding the cold iron bars by touch. "Clara, I am right here. You are safe." His words were swallowed by her ragged breathing. He could hear her terror, a living thing in the small, dark space. His lawman's brain screamed at him, told him the rules, the danger. But the man, the one who had listened to her story and heard her hymn, was already fumbling with the key. The lock was stiff, but he forced it, the screech of the metal lost in the next roll of thunder. He pushed the cell door open and stepped inside, into the total blackness with her. "I am here," he said softly. "It is just the dark." He reached out, trying to find her, and his hand brushed against the rough sleeve of her dress. She flinched violently, and he froze. Then, tentatively, he reached again, and this time his hand found hers. Her skin was ice cold. She was trembling uncontrollably. His hand, calloused and warm from the stove, closed around hers. The contact was like a lightning strike of its own, a jolt of heat and life that passed between them in the dark. He felt the fine bones of her hand, the frantic pulse at her wrist. It was the first time they had touched, an act of comfort, an act of trespass. The physical closeness was unnerving, a violation of every rule that was supposed to govern their interaction. He was the lawman. She was the prisoner. He was in her cell, in the dark, holding her hand. Yet, as the seconds ticked by, a strange calm began to settle over the space. Her trembling lessened, her breathing steadied, the panic receded, replaced by a tense, charged awareness. He could smell the rain on her clothes, the faint, clean scent of lye soap in her hair. He should have let go. He should have stepped back, found the matches, restored the light in the distance between them. But he did not, and she did not pull her hand away. They stood there together in the darkness, connected by that single, simple point of contact, while the storm raged on outside. After what felt like an eternity, he remembered the matches in his pocket, still holding her hand. He fumbled for the box with his other, struck a match against the stone wall. The sudden flare of light was blinding, in its brief, flickering life. He saw her face, inches from his own. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted, her expression a mixture of lingering fear and something new, something questioning. The match went out. He struck another and managed to light the wick of the small lantern he kept on the floor just outside the cell for emergencies. A soft, steady glow filled the space, chasing the worst of the shadows into the corners. The light was kinder than the harsh glare of the office lantern had been. It softened the edges of the grim cell, turning it into something more intimate, a sanctuary. He finally released her hand. The absence of her touch left his own feeling strangely cold and empty. He took a step back, putting a respectable distance between them. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice now husky. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. "I am sorry," she whispered. I do not like the dark. Not when I am locked in." "There is nothing to be sorry for," he said. He should leave. He knew he should. Lock the door, go back to his chair, pretend this had never happened. He turned, his body moving toward the door, toward duty. "You do not have to go." The words were a whisper, barely audible above the rain. He stopped, his back to her. He did not turn around. He could not, if he looked at her now. He was not sure what he would do. "Please," she said, and there was a tremor in her voice. But it was not from fear this time. It was a plea for company, for a human presence to stand against the storm and the loneliness and the dark. Slowly, he turned. She was still standing by the cot, watching him, her face illuminated by the soft lantern light. The wariness in her eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability that mirrored his own. He walked out of the cell, but he did not lock the door. He pulled his heavy wooden chair from the office and placed it in the doorway, half in the cell, half out. He sat down, a silent guardian in the space between their two worlds. He was breaking every rule he had sworn to uphold, but for the first time since he had pinned on the star, he felt like he was doing the right thing. He stayed there until the storm finally broke and the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the grimy window, promising a new day. The uneasy truce of the dawn did not last. As the rain lessened to a miserable, persistent drizzle, the town of Dry Creek began to stir, its people emerging like groundhogs from their burrows to survey the damage. The street was a swamp of thick, red mud, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and sodden wood. But more than the flood, the town was stirring with a current of another kind, gossip, sharp and venomous, and it flowed directly from the mercantile. Martha Tate, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched with disapproval, had seen Eli take the breakfast plate to the jail. She had noted the way he knelt, the time he lingered. Her small, bird-like eyes missed nothing, and her tongue was a weapon she wielded with practiced skill. By mid-morning, the story had been embellished and passed from neighbor to neighbor over sagging fence posts and across muddy thresholds. The deputy was not just feeding the prisoner, he was consorting with her. He was falling under her spell. "She has bewitched him, I tell you," Mrs. Tate declared to anyone who would listen, her voice a shrill whisper that carried easily in the damp air. A woman like that, with no shame, she knows how to use her looks to twist a man's mind, especially a man like Eli Ward, who has his own weaknesses. She did not need to specify what those weaknesses were. Everyone in Dry Creek remembered the brawl, the body, the shame that still clung to the deputy like a shadow. The implication was clear. Clara was a temptress, and Eli, a man with a flawed character, was her natural prey. The pressure on Eli began as a series of sideways glances, a sudden quiet that fell when he stepped out of the jailhouse for a breath of air. Men who would normally greet him with a nod now studied the mud at their boots. By afternoon, it became more direct. The preacher, Reverend Thompson, paid him a visit. He was a tall, severe man whose piety was as unyielding as the stone of his church. He entered the jail office, his black coat shedding droplets of rain onto the floorboards, his Bible clutched in one hand like a shield. "Deputy," he began, his voice deep and resonant, "I have come as a friend and as a shepherd to his flock. The town is troubled." Eli stood by his desk, his arms crossed over his chest. "If they are troubled about the flood, they can rest easy. The creek will go down in a day or two." "It is not the water that concerns them," the preacher said, his gaze hard. "It is the flood of sin you are allowing to pool within these walls. The woman, Clara Monroe, she is a thief, accused before God and this community." "She is accused," Eli corrected him, his voice low and steady. "She has not been proven a thief." "The town believes it. Mr. Tate is a respected man," Reverend Thompson countered. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Son, I know your history. I know you have walked a difficult path and have sought to redeem yourself in the eyes of the Lord and this town by upholding the law. Do not let this fallen woman drag you back into the darkness. She is a snare for the righteous. The serpent in the garden often takes the most pleasing form." Eli's jaw tightened. Every word was a carefully aimed dart, meant to prick at the old wound of his past. The preacher was reminding him of his place, of the fragile peace he had made with the community. He was an outsider, a sinner given a chance at penance, and that chance was conditional. "My duty is to hold her until the judge arrives," Eli said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "That is all I am doing." "Is it?" the Reverend asked, his eyes boring into Eli's. "See that your heart does not lead you astray from your duty. A lawman cannot afford pity, especially not for a woman of her kind." He placed a heavy hand on Eli's shoulder. "Pray on it, son. Pray you are not losing yourself for a soul that is already lost." With a final, meaningful look toward the cell, the preacher turned and left, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more damning than his words. Eli felt a cold fury rise in him, followed by a wave of suffocating helplessness. He was caught in a trap not of his own making, and the bars were closing in. Clara heard it all. The small, high window of her cell, though barred, faced the alley that ran alongside the jail. As the day wore on, it became a thoroughfare for gossip. She heard the whispers, snippets of conversations carried on the damp air. "Martha Tate says he sits with her for hours. He's shameless, using her widow's plight to get sympathy. My Henry says her husband was glad for the release. The preacher himself had to speak with the deputy, worried for his soul. He is—" Each word was a stone thrown against the fragile walls of her composure. She had endured their judgment for months, holding her head high, retreating into a shell of quiet dignity. But to be discussed like this, to have her grief and her struggle twisted into something ugly and manipulative, was more than she could bear. The worst part was that they were dragging Eli down with her. They were using his kindness against him, painting him with the same brush of shame they used on her. She backed away from the window, pressing herself into the far corner of the cell, as if she could make herself small enough to disappear. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, a sound of such profound despair that it seemed torn from the very depths of her being. She sank onto the cot, burying her face in the thin, rough blanket, and wept. She cried for her lost husband, for her ruined name, for the crushing loneliness that was her entire world, and she cried for the one man who had shown her a sliver of compassion, only to have it turned into another weapon to be used against them both. When Eli brought her supper that evening, another grim plate of beans and bread, he found her huddled on the cot, her eyes red and swollen. The plate in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "Clara?" he asked softly, using her first name without thinking. She looked up, her face a mask of misery. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Let me go," she repeated, a desperate urgency in her tone. She stood up and came to the bars, her hands gripping them. "Unlock the door and let me walk out of here. I will run. I will go so far away that no one from this town will ever see me again." "I cannot do that," he said, his own voice tight with emotion. "You know I cannot." "Why not?" she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes again. "Because it is your duty. Your duty is to a town that hates me, that is now starting to hate you because of me. I heard them. I heard everything. I would rather be a fugitive, hunted in the wilderness, than be pitied and scorned in this cage. At least out there, my shame would be my own. Running would only prove their accusations," he argued. But the words felt hollow, a weak defense against the storm of her pain. His voice trembled slightly as he said it, a betrayal of the conflict raging inside him. He knew she was right. He knew the town's poison. "What is there to prove?" she cried, her voice breaking. "They have already decided I am guilty. They decided it the day I buried my husband. Can you not see? There is no justice for me here. Please, Eli, let me go." He stood there, torn between the law he had sworn to uphold and the woman whose suffering was becoming his own. He looked into her pleading eyes and saw not a criminal, but a victim. And in her desperation, he saw a mirror of his own desire to escape, to run from the man he had been and the judgment that still followed him. Later that night, the storm returned with a vengeance. Rain slashed against the tin roof in furious, metallic sheets, and the wind howled through the cracks in the stone walls. The world was reduced to the small, lamp-lit space of the jailhouse, an ark of fragile quiet in a sea of chaos. The raw emotion of their earlier confrontation lingered in the air, a tension that was almost unbearable. They sat in silence for a long time. He in his chair in the doorway, she on the edge of her cot. The storm outside seemed to be pulling the truth from the very marrow of their bones. Finally, Clara broke the silence, her voice soft but clear over the drumming of the rain. "You are trapped in here too, are you not?" He did not pretend to misunderstand her. "What do you mean?" "I have seen it in your eyes since you brought me here," she said, her gaze steady and knowing. "This badge, this town, it is a cage for you, just like this cell is for me. You told me what they say about me. What do they say about you? Eli? What are you running from?" The question hit him with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever asked him that. They had judged him, whispered about him, and then, when he put on the star, they had cautiously accepted his penance, but no one had ever asked him to speak the truth of it. He looked away from her, toward the darkness outside the window. But all he saw was the past, the smell of whiskey and sawdust, the flash of anger, the terrible, final sound of a life ending because of his hands. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had lived inside him for the past year. "I killed a man," he said, the words tasting like rust. He did not look at her, could not bear to see the accusation that would surely fill her eyes. "His name was Miller, a freight driver. We were in the saloon. Both of us had been drinking too much. He accused me of cheating at cards. I was proud and angry. We fought. I hit him with a bottle." He paused, the memory vivid and sickening. He fell. and he did not get up again. He finally forced himself to look at her. Her face was not filled with horror or judgment. It was filled with a deep, compassionate stillness. She was just listening. "They called it self-defense," he continued, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Miller was a known brawler. I had friends who spoke for me, but I knew, in my heart, I knew I had meant to hurt him. I had an anger in me back then, a wildness. That night, I let it out. It cost that man his life, and it cost me everything. My place, my name. I used to believe in God, in right and wrong. After that night, I did not know what I believed in anymore. So I took this badge. I thought if I spent my life forcing other men to follow the rules, maybe I could chain up the part of me that broke them. Maybe I could build a wall of duty so high that no one, not even me, could see the sinner hiding behind it." He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air between them. He had never spoken these words aloud to another living soul. He felt stripped bare, exposed. Clara did not speak for a long moment. The rain hammered on the roof, a relentless drumbeat marking the passage of time. Then she took a shaky breath. "I stole once," she said, her voice a near whisper. "It was the winter after Thomas and I were first married. He had a fever, a terrible one. We were new to the territory, had no money, no friends. He had not eaten in 2 days. He was wasting away. I went to the store in the town we were in then, and I stole a loaf of bread and a small piece of salted pork. I slipped them under my shawl. My heart was beating so fast I thought I would fall down right there. But I did not. I took the food home, and I made him a broth. He ate it. He got well." She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. "I have gone to church my whole life. I know that stealing is a sin, but I have never, not for one single moment, been sorry for it. I would do it again to save him. Does that make me a bad person?" She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I stole that food to keep my husband alive, but I did not steal Mr. Tate's money. I did not." In that moment, a profound and unshakable truth settled in Eli's soul. He believed her. He believed her more than he believed in the law, more than he believed in the town, more than he believed in his own tarnished redemption. They were the same, the two of them, both branded by a single act, judged by a world that could not understand the reasons of the heart. His was an act of anger, hers an act of love. But they had both crossed a line, and they were both living in the aftermath. He stood up, his movements slow, deliberate. He walked to the cell door, the heavy iron key in his hand. The rain seemed to crescendo, a wild symphony of their shared turmoil. He slid the key into the lock. It made a loud, grating sound as he turned it. He pulled the bolt back and swung the heavy door inward, leaving an open path to the office, to the front door, to the dark, rain-swept world beyond. Clara stared at the open doorway, her breath catching in her throat. "There," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "You wanted to go. You can. The storm will cover your tracks. You could be miles away by sunrise. No one would ever find you." She rose from the cot, her body trembling. She looked from his face to the dark promise of freedom in the open doorway. She took one step, then another, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. She was outside the cell. For the first time in days, there were no bars between them. She stood before him, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath, see the storm reflected in her wide, tear-filled eyes. She could run. He had given her the chance, a reprieve from the town's judgment, an escape. But instead of turning toward the door, she slowly, hesitantly, raised her hand, not to push him away, not to flee, but to reach for him. Her small, trembling hand found his, her fingers lacing through his. The touch was electric, a current that sealed a silent, unspoken pact between them. She looked up at him, and a sad, fragile smile touched her lips. "Keep me here," she whispered, her voice a raw, breaking plea that was also a statement of profound and devastating trust. "I like it." He did not move. He did not breathe. He simply stood there, holding her hand, the open door forgotten. Outside, a long, low roll of thunder echoed across the plains, like the world itself was groaning under the weight of their impossible choice. In the small, lamp-lit jail, surrounded by the storm, they had found a strange and terrible kind of freedom. Not in escape, but in confinement. Together, the world was born anew in silence and mud. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a sky washed clean and pale, as if exhausted by its own fury. A watery sun cast long, weak shadows across a landscape transformed. The roar of the creek had subsided to a steady, powerful murmur, and the only sounds were the drip of water from the eaves of the jailhouse and the melancholy call of a distant bird. The bridge was gone, a few splintered timbers clinging to the muddy bank, the only evidence it had ever existed. Dry Creek was cut off from the world, a small, damaged ship adrift in a sea of red-brown mire. Inside the jail, a different kind of silence reigned. Eli had not returned to his chair in the doorway. He had spent the remainder of the night on a bedroll on the floor of his office, the cell door left standing open. It was a silent testament to the line they had crossed, a declaration that the roles of prisoner and guard had been irrevocably altered. When Clara awoke on her narrow cot, the first thing she saw was that open door. It was a rectangle of profound possibility and terrifying freedom. She rose and walked softly to the threshold, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone. Eli was still asleep, his face turned away from her, one arm flung over his head. In sleep, the harsh lines of his face were softened. The constant tension in his jaw was gone. He looked younger, more vulnerable. He looked like the man who had confessed his sins in the dark, not the unyielding lawman who had locked her away. A powerful, protective tenderness swelled in her chest, so fierce it almost frightened her. Their new life began in these small, quiet moments. Survival became their shared purpose, a simple, focusing rhythm that pushed the looming threat of the outside world to the back of their minds. Their supplies were dangerously low: half a sack of flour, a small tin of coffee, a few wizened potatoes, and a slab of salt pork. They had to make it last. "We will have to ration," Eli said that first morning, his voice still thick with sleep as he surveyed their meager stores. He did not look at her directly, his gaze fixed on the shelves, but the wordway hung in the air between them, a small, sturdy anchor. Their days fell into a pattern of cautious domesticity. He would venture out into the mud-choked street to check the water level and see if anyone needed help, his boots making sucking sounds with every step. She would stay inside, sweeping the stone floor, keeping the small stove lit against the persistent damp, turning the jailhouse from a place of confinement into something that almost felt like a home. They spoke, but not of the things that mattered most. They did not speak of her accusation or his confession. They did not speak of the open cell door. Instead, they spoke of small things. She told him how to make the flour stretch by adding potato water to the dough for their bread. He told her how to read the clouds to know if more rain was coming. Their conversations were filled with hesitant laughter, small kindnesses that felt monumental in their isolation. One afternoon, he returned with 2 slightly bruised apples, a gift from a grateful homesteader whose fence he had helped mend. He offered one to her, and they ate them in a companionable silence. The crisp, sweet fruit, a luxury that felt as decadent as a feast. One evening, Clara noticed a long tear in the sleeve of his shirt, snagged on a nail or a piece of splintered wood. "Give that to me," she said, her voice gentle but firm. He looked down at his arm as if noticing the tear for the first time. "It is nothing. It will be a gaping hole by morning if you do not mend it," she insisted, holding out her hand. "My sewing basket. It is all I have of my trade." He hesitated, then shrugged and pulled the shirt off over his head. For a moment, he stood before her in his undershirt, his shoulders broad, his arms corded with muscle. An uncomfortable heat rose in Clara's cheeks, and she quickly looked away, focusing on the task at hand. She took the shirt and her basket, sitting on the edge of her cot, her fingers, nimble and sure, went to work. The needle moved in a swift, even rhythm, pulling the torn fabric together in a seam so neat it was almost invisible. Eli did not go back to his desk. He sat in the chair he had placed in the doorway, watching her. He watched the way the lantern light caught the stray strands of her hair, turning them to gold. He watched the focused intensity in her eyes, the deft movements of her hands. It was a simple act, a woman mending a shirt, but in the quiet intimacy of the jailhouse, it felt like so much more. It was an act of care, of tenderness. He had not had anyone care for him in that simple, unassuming way in a very long time. When she was finished, she bit the thread and held the shirt up for inspection. "There," she said, a small, proud smile on her face. "Good as new." He took it from her, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through both of them. "Thank you, Clara," he said, his voice lower than before. Another evening. A deep chill settled in the stone walls. The fire in the stove did its best, but the dampness clung to everything. Clara sat on the floor near the stove, rubbing her hands together, trying to chase away the cold that seemed to have settled in her bones. Eli came and knelt beside her. "Your hands are like ice," he murmured. He reached out and took her hands in his own. His were large, warm, and rough with calluses, and they enveloped hers completely. He began to chafe them gently, his thumbs moving in slow, soothing circles over her palms. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it quickly became something else. He did not let go. He just held her hands, the warmth from his body seeping into hers, a slow, spreading heat that had nothing to do with the fire. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his strength seemed to surround her fragility. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of his pulse against her skin. He lingered, longer than he should have, longer than was necessary to simply warm her hands. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with a longing that was as palpable as the heat from the stove. When he finally released her, they both looked away, a shared and flustered recognition of the line they were continuing to cross. The physical barrier of the cell door was gone, but the iron bars still stood, a constant, silent reminder of their reality. As the days wore on, they began to use the cell again, not as a prison, but as a bedroom. It was an unspoken agreement. When night fell, she would retreat to the cot, and he would take his bedroll in the office. It was a way of maintaining a sliver of propriety, a fragile boundary in a situation that had none, but he never locked the door. One night, the loneliness was a sharp, physical ache in Clara's chest. The moon was a bright, cold sliver in the small, grimy window of the cell. She could hear the soft sound of Eli's breathing from the other room, a steady, comforting presence in the dark. She thought of everything they had shared, their confessions, their fears, the small kindnesses that had become the foundation of their strange, shared life. He had seen the worst of her shame, and he had not turned away. He had shared the worst of his own. She could not bear the distance between them, even the few feet that separated the cell from the office. She rose from the cot and walked to the bars, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was not asleep. She could see his silhouette in the moonlight spilling from the window, sitting up on his bedroll, staring into the darkness. "Eli," she whispered. He turned his head. "Clara, you should be sleeping." "I cannot," she said. She reached a hand through the bars, her fingers trembling. She did not know what she meant to do, only that she had to bridge the gap between them. "I was thinking about what you told me, about the man you killed, and what I told you." He stood and came to the bars, stopping just inches from her outstretched hand. In the pale moonlight, his face was a landscape of shadows and sorrows. "You have never looked at me like a sinner," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You have never looked at me with pity. You just look at me as I am." He did not speak, but she saw the conflict in his eyes, the deep, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. Her hand moved, slowly, until her fingertips brushed against the rough stubble on his cheek. His skin was warm. He flinched at the contact, a sharp intake of breath, but he did not pull away. She let her palm rest against his face, a gesture of profound and absolute trust. "I trust you," she whispered, and the words were not about her safety from him, but about the safety of her heart. "I trust you with my brokenness. I trust you with my shame." He closed his eyes, a shudder running through him. He leaned into her touch, a weary man surrendering to a comfort he did not believe he deserved. For a long moment, they stood like that, a tableau of impossible tenderness framed by the cold iron bars. He was a man torn apart. Everything he had tried to build, his penance, his duty, the fragile wall around his heart, was crumbling under the gentle weight of her hand. The guilt was a bitter taste in his mouth, warring with a longing so powerful it threatened to consume him. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm more firmly against his face. Then, with a ragged sigh that sounded like a final surrender, he stepped back. His hand went to the cell door, to the bolt he had left unlocked for days. He slid it open, but this time was different. He was not opening it for mercy, not to offer her escape or comfort her from a storm. He was opening it because his own need, his own desperate desire for connection, had finally overwhelmed his shame. He stepped into the cell with her, pulling the door closed behind them. The small space, which had once been her prison, became their sanctuary. In the dim moonlit room, there were no more bars between them, no more roles to play. There was only a man and a woman, two lonely souls who had found each other in the wreckage. Their intimacy was a quiet, desperate thing. It was tender, filled with the hesitant discovery of two people who had forgotten what it felt like to be touched with kindness. But it was also shadowed by a deep and abiding shame. Each touch, each whispered word, was a transgression. He was a lawman. She was his prisoner. What they were doing could ruin them both, utterly and completely. It was a sin, not just in the eyes of the town or of God, but against the very structure of the world they lived in. And yet, in that small cell, lost to the world, it felt more honest and more real than anything either of them had ever known. The next morning, the sun rose bright and unforgiving. Its clear, sharp light streamed through the window, illuminating every speck of dust in the air, leaving no room for shadows or secrets. Clara awoke first. Eli was asleep beside her on the narrow cot, his arm thrown protectively over her waist. For a blissful, unguarded moment, she felt a profound sense of peace. Then he stirred. His eyes opened, and for a second, they were soft with sleep. He looked at her, and she saw a flicker of the same tenderness from the night before. But then, awareness dawned. The reality of where they were, of what they had done, crashed down on him. The softness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a shuttered, haunted look. He pulled his arm away as if he had been burned and sat up abruptly, his back to her. "I have to check the creek," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. He did not look at her. He stood, pulled on his shirt, the one she had mended, and walked out of the cell without a backward glance. Clara lay there, the warmth where he had been already fading. A cold dread seeped into her, chilling her to the bone. She felt the return of the coldness between them, the wall of his regret rising higher and stronger than any iron bars. His shame was a palpable thing in the small room, and it felt like a judgment against her, against the fragile, beautiful thing they had shared. Later that morning, as she sat in the office, trying to read a page from an old almanac, she heard it, A new sound, cutting through the quiet murmur of the creek. It was the clang of a hammer against steel, followed by the distant shout of a man's voice. Then another. Eli came in, his face grim. "They are starting on the bridge," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. "A work party from the Miller Ranch came down from the north side. They will have a temporary crossing built in a day or two." The world was returning. The sounds of rebuilding, of society putting itself back together, were a death knell for their isolation. Soon, the road would be open. Soon, the judge would arrive. Soon, their time in this strange, suspended reality would be over. Clara looked at Eli's averted face, at the rigid set of his shoulders. She heard the hammers ringing in the distance, each strike chipping away at the walls of their sanctuary. The fragile connection they had built in the heart of the storm, the thing that felt so real and vital in the darkness, now seemed impossibly frail in the light of the returning day. She wondered, with a growing sense of panic, if something like love could ever survive once the cell door was finally, truly, thrown open, or if, like a dream, it was doomed to vanish with the morning sun. The sound of the hammers on the new bridge was the sound of the world returning, and it arrived in the form of a single rider sloshing through the mud on a tired bay horse. Sheriff Holt was a man carved from the same hard rock as the canyons that surrounded Dry Creek. His face was a map of sun and wind, and his eyes a pale, piercing blue. Missed nothing. He reined in his horse in front of the jail, his gaze taking in the mud-caked building, the steam rising from the wet earth, and the strange, tense quiet that seemed to hang over the place. He swung down from the saddle, his spurs making a deadened clink in the thick mud. He did not bother to knock. The door creaked open, and he stood there, filling the frame, his presence immediately shrinking the small office. Eli rose from his desk, the fragile peace of the last few days shattered like glass. "Ward," Holt said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He took off his hat, slapping it against his thigh to knock off the rain and dust. "Reports reached me the bridge was out. What in the hell happened here, and what is this I hear about you keeping Silas Tate's thief locked up all this time?" His eyes flicked from Eli's grim face to the open cell door, where Clara stood frozen, a deer caught in the glare of a lantern. Holt's eyebrows drew together in a sharp, questioning line. He looked at the unmade cot, at the sewing basket on the floor, at the woman who was clearly not being treated like a prisoner, and a deep, knowing suspicion settled on his face. "Sheriff," Eli began, his voice steady despite the frantic pounding of his heart, "there has been a development." "I can see that," Holt said, his tone dry and hard. He did not take his eyes off Clara. "Start talking, deputy, and it had better make sense. I want an account of the prisoner, and I want to see the evidence against her." The moment had come. The lie had to end. "There is no evidence," Eli said, the words clear and defiant, "because she did not do it." Holt's gaze snapped back to Eli. "What are you talking about? Silas Tate himself rode halfway to meet me, complaining you were dragging your feet. Yesterday morning, I went to the Mercantile to ask Mr. Tate a few more questions," Eli explained, his voice gaining strength as he spoke the truth. "His story had holes in it. He said he was the last one in the store, but I saw his wife leaving out the back after he had locked the front. While I was there, I went into the storeroom. Tate was carrying on, and I made like I was checking his inventory against the freight manifest. I found the money." "You found it where?" Holt demanded, stepping further into the room. "It was in an old tea canister, tucked behind a sack of dried beans on the highest shelf. All $20, folded up tight. It was not misplaced. It was hidden." A heavy silence fell over the room. Clara let out a shaky breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her innocence, a thing she had known in her soul but had begun to fear she would never hear spoken aloud, was now a fact, stated plainly in the harsh light of day. Sheriff Holt stared at Eli for a long, hard moment. Then his gaze shifted to Clara. He studied her pale, tired face, and the hardness in his eyes seemed to soften, just a fraction. He had been a lawman in this territory for 30 years. He knew a true criminal when he saw one, and he knew the petty, cruel ways of small-town folk. "Martha Tate," Holt said, more to himself than to anyone else. "She has always had expensive tastes." He let out a long sigh, the sound of a man weary of human folly. He looked at Clara. "Ma'am, it seems you are free to go. My apologies for your accommodation. The county will not be pressing charges." Freedom. The word should have been a song, a soaring release. It should have brought a rush of joy, a flood of relief. But as Eli and Clara's eyes met across the room, they felt only a cold, sickening dread. Her freedom was a guillotine, poised to drop and sever the fragile, impossible bond they had forged in their isolation. Her freedom meant she would walk out that door, back to her cabin, and then, inevitably, away from this town that had so wrongly accused her. Her freedom meant leaving him. And for Eli, her freedom meant facing the consequences of what had happened within these stone walls, the secret of their intimacy, a thing born of darkness and desperation, could not survive the light. The town, and Sheriff Holt, would see his defense of her not as an act of justice, but as the culmination of a sordid affair between a corrupt lawman and a manipulative woman. Their secret would destroy them just as surely as the accusation of theft would have destroyed her. The news of Clara's exoneration spread through Dry Creek not like a cleansing fire, but like a foul smoke. It did not clear her name. It only thickened the cloud of suspicion that hung over her and Eli. The townsfolk, led by a furious and humiliated Martha Tate, did not see justice. They saw a conspiracy. "He let her go, Mrs." Tate shrieked from the porch of the Mercantile, her voice carrying across the muddy street. "That sinful woman turned his head, and he concocted this story to protect her. He is as guilty as she is." The narrative was simple, ugly, and easy for the town to believe. Clara had used her feminine wiles to corrupt the deputy. He had betrayed his duty for the sake of a fallen woman. The fact that the money was found in the Tate's own storeroom was twisted into proof of their shared cunning. Clearly, they had planted it there together. When Eli walked with Clara from the jailhouse back to her small cabin, it was like walking through a hostile, foreign country. Every window seemed to hold a pair of accusing eyes. Whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. People who had known him for years now turned their backs as he approached, their faces set in masks of cold condemnation. Clara walked with her head held high, her gaze fixed on the door of her cabin. But he could feel the tremors running through her arm where he held it. He could feel her shame, her fear, a protective fury, white-hot and absolute, burned away the last vestiges of his own guilt. He no longer cared what they thought of him. He no longer cared about his penance or his badge. All he cared about was the woman walking beside him. As they neared her cabin, a group of men stood clustered near the path, loafers from the saloon who had been drawn out by the commotion. One of them, a lanky mule skinner named Jed, stepped forward. His face was twisted in a belligerent sneer. "Well, look here," Jed drawled, his eyes raking over Clara with open contempt. "If it is not the deputy and his little jailbird, heard you sang a sweet song for him. Ma'am, must have been mighty convincing." Eli's hand dropped to the butt of his pistol. "That is enough! Jed, get out of the way!" But Jed was drunk on self-righteousness and the approval of his friends. He took another step closer, and then he spat. A thick gob of tobacco juice landed in the mud, just inches from the hem of Clara's dress. It was the final desecration. In that instant, Eli Ward, the penitent deputy, died, and Eli Ward, the man, the protector, was born. He moved so fast it was a blur. One moment he was standing beside Clara, the next his gun was drawn, the barrel pressed firmly under Jed's chin, forcing his head back at a sharp, unnatural angle. The click of the hammer being pulled back was terrifyingly loud in the sudden, shocked silence. You so much as breathe in her direction again, Eli said, his voice a low, lethal whisper, colder than any winter wind. And I will see you buried right where you stand. Now apologize to the lady. Jed's eyes were wide with terror, his face a pasty white. He tried to swallow, but could not. I'm sorry, ma'am, he stammered, the words catching in his throat. Eli held him there for a second longer, letting the fear sink in, letting the entire town see that he had drawn a line in the mud, a line he would kill to defend. Then he shoved Jed backward, sending him stumbling into his friends, and holstered his weapon. Eli, no, Clara whispered, her hand clutching his arm. Her face was ashen. Please, do not do this. He turned to her, his eyes still blazing with a cold fire. I do not want any more blood spilled for my sake, she pleaded, her voice trembling. She looked from his face to the hostile faces of the men watching them, and she saw only more pain, more violence. She thought of her husband, lost to the violence of the earth. She thought of the man Eli had killed. This was a cycle she could not bear to see continue. It is not worth it. I am not worth it. You are worth all of it, he said, his voice raw with an intensity that stunned her into silence. He led her the rest of the way to her cabin, the crowd parting before them as if he were a leper. He pushed open her door and ushered her inside the small, cold room. It smelled of dust and disuse. He closed the door, shutting out the hate-filled eyes of the world. She was leaving. It was the only option. She could not stay in a town that despised her, that would make her life a living hell. She would pack her few belongings, her sewing basket, and in the morning, she would walk east until she found a place where the name Clara Monroe meant nothing. That night, as darkness fell over Dry Creek, she could not bear to stay in the cabin alone. The shadows seemed to be filled with the faces of the townsfolk. She walked back through the deserted, muddy street, a lone ghost moving through a town that had already cast her out. The lamp was lit in the jailhouse office. Eli was sitting at his desk, his badge and his gun belt lying on the polished wood in front of him. He was staring at them as if they were artifacts from another man's life. He looked up as she entered. He did not seem surprised to see her. I came to say goodbye, she said softly. He stood and walked toward her, stopping in front of the open cell. He looked into the small, dark space where their world had been born and was now about to die. Without a word, he reached out and slowly pulled the heavy, barred door shut. It moved with a familiar groan. Then, he took the large iron key from its hook. She watched, her heart constricting. As he slid the key into the lock, he turned it. The sound of the bolt sliding home was not the harsh, final clang of a prison. It was a soft, heavy click, a sound of remembrance. He was not locking her in. He was sealing a memory, preserving the one place in the entire world where they had been free. She stepped forward, her hands gripping the bars that now separated them once again. Tears she had held back all day finally began to fall, tracing clean paths through the grime and sorrow on her face. I will never see you again, she whispered, the words a final, heartbreaking admission of their fate. The life they had found together was ending before it had ever had a chance to begin. He stepped closer, his own face a mask of anguish. He reached through the bars, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. He leaned forward until his forehead rested against the cold iron. He pressed his lips to hers through the bars, a kiss that was desperate and tender and full of all the words they would never get to say. It was a kiss of farewell, a brand of a memory on her soul. When he pulled back, his eyes were shining with a fierce, unwavering light. Then I will stay here too, he whispered, his voice thick and breaking. He was not talking about the cell. He was talking about the space they had created, the memory, the feeling. If she had to live in exile with the memory of him, then he would remain here, a prisoner of the same memory. He would not leave, because leaving would mean letting her go. And that, he knew, he could never do. The resignation was a quiet affair, devoid of the drama the town might have craved. 2 weeks after Clara had ridden away, Eli stood before Sheriff Holt in the small office that had been his world and his prison. He placed the tin star on the desk. It made a small, dull sound against the wood. Beside it, he laid his gun belt, the leather worn smooth in places from his hand. "I reckon my time is done here, Sheriff," Eli said, his voice even. Holt looked from the badge to Eli's face. The lawman's eyes, which had seen so much, were not filled with anger, but with a deep, weary understanding. He had seen how the town had turned on Eli, the cold shoulders, the muttered insults. He had also seen the change in his deputy, the hard shell of penance replaced by a fierce, quiet certainty. "A man draws a line for himself, Ward," Holt said, his voice a low rumble. "Some men draw it in the sand. You went and carved yours in granite. This town does not have a long memory for a man's good deeds, but its memory for what it considers a transgression is eternal." "It was not a transgression," Eli stated, "not as a defense, but as a simple fact." "To you, maybe not," Holt conceded, picking up the star and turning it over in his gnarled fingers. "To them, you chose a woman of ill repute over your duty to their laws. It does not matter if she was innocent of the theft. In their eyes, you are both guilty of something far worse. What will you do?" "I have some money saved," Eli said. "I can tend to horses. I am good with them. They do not judge a man's soul." Holt nodded slowly. "This badge did not suit you. Son, you wore it like a hair shirt. Maybe you will finally find some peace without it." He slid the star into his desk drawer and closed it with a soft, final thud. The sound echoed the closing of a chapter in Eli's life. The town's coldness was a physical thing, a wall of ice he walked through every day. When he went to the mercantile for supplies, Silas Tate, his face still a mask of puffy indignation, would serve him in stony silence, slapping his change on the counter as if it were contaminated. The preacher, Reverend Thompson, would cross the muddy street to avoid passing him on the boardwalk. The women of the town would pull their children close when he walked by, whispering behind their hands. He was a disgrace, a lawman who had forgotten the law, a sinner who had embraced his sin. Eli bore their scorn with a strange sense of detachment. It could not touch him. Their judgment was a distant noise, like the buzz of flies on a hot day. The only thing that felt real was the profound, aching emptiness that Clara's absence had left behind. He sold his horse and his saddle, using the money to rent the small, abandoned livery stable at the edge of town, the one that abutted the back of the jail. He spent his days mending tack, resetting shoes, and tending to the horses of the few travelers who passed through. The work was hard and honest, and the quiet company of the animals was a balm to his soul. But every evening, as the sun began its slow, fiery descent, he would find himself drawn back to the jailhouse. Sheriff Holt let him be. The old lawman understood that the place held something for Eli that no one else could see. He would sit in his old chair, now just a piece of furniture in an empty room, and stare at the cell. The door stood open, just as he had left it. In the fading light, he could almost see her there, her hands moving with a needle and thread, her soft humming a ghost on the quiet air. He had lost his honor, his place in the world, but he did not regret it. He had traded it all for a handful of days that had felt more true than his entire life before them. Miles away, in a dusty little town called Harmony, Clara Monroe was trying to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. She had found work with a seamstress, a kind, elderly widow named Mrs. Gable, who asked no questions and judged no one. Clara's hands were never idle. She stitched dresses for ranchers' wives and mended shirts for farmhands, her needle moving in a relentless, steady rhythm from sunup to sundown. The constant motion was a mercy, a way to keep her mind from wandering back to the place it desperately wanted to go. But it always did. Her small room at the boarding house was clean and safe. but it felt like the truest prison she had ever known. Its 4 blank walls offered no comfort, only a stark reflection of her own solitude. Every evening she would stand at her small window and watch the sun set, painting the western sky in brilliant, heartbreaking streaks of orange and purple. She would look west, toward Dry Creek, and the distance felt like a physical weight on her heart. She would press a hand to her chest, trying to still the ache, the wound of his memory that would not close. They lived in their quiet, separate exiles. Her reputation was a stained and tattered thing she could never fully mend. His honor was a ghost that no longer followed him. But they were bound by a shared memory, a secret that was both a treasure and a torment. In the dark of night, they would both find themselves back in that small stone cell, in the heart of the storm, reliving the moments that had both saved and ruined them. The world saw 2 disgraced and lonely people, but in their own hearts, they were still there, together, in the only place they had ever truly been free. One Sunday, a traveling preacher set up a makeshift pulpit on the steps of the Harmony General Store. He was an old man with a kind, weathered face and a gentle voice that spoke more of grace than of damnation. Clara, who had not set foot in a church since leaving Dry Creek, found herself stopping to listen. After the sermon, as the small crowd dispersed, the preacher was talking with Mrs. Gable. "I just came from Dry Creek," the old man was saying. "A hard town, still shaking off the last of the floodwaters. A lot of hard hearts in that place. I am afraid—" Clara's own heart gave a painful lurch. She tried to walk away, not wanting to hear any more, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. "It is a shame what they did to that young woman," Mrs. Gable said, shaking her head. "And to the deputy who stood for her. It takes a strong man to stand against the tide of gossip." "Amen to that," the preacher said. "I saw the man, Ward. His name is. He is not a deputy any longer. He lives a quiet life, tending to horses in the old livery. Does not say much to anyone. Seems to be carrying a heavy burden." The preacher paused, his brow furrowed in thought. "There is a sadness about him, a deep loneliness. But when I looked in his eyes, I did not see a disgraced man. I saw a man who is waiting." "A man who is waiting." The word struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. She turned and walked away, her vision blurring with tears. He had not left. He had stayed. He was there, living alone, just a stone's throw from the cell where she had last seen him. Her promise to herself to start over, to forget, to move on, crumbled into dust. The emptiness she had been trying to fill with endless work and quiet obedience was no longer bearable. It was a hollow ache that demanded to be filled. The memory was not enough. The wound would not close because a part of her was still there, in Dry Creek, with him. That night, she could not sleep. The preacher's words echoed in her mind. "A man who is waiting." She lay in her narrow bed, staring into the darkness, and knew with a certainty that shook her to her very soul that she could not live this half-life any longer. To live without him was not to live at all. Before the first hint of dawn, she was up. She packed her few belongings into a small cloth bundle. She took her sewing basket, her only worldly possession of any value. She left a note for Mrs. Gable, a simple message of thanks, and tucked what little money she had under the old woman's pillow. Then, she slipped out of the boarding house and went to the town stable. She used the last of her savings to buy a gentle, sway-backed mare, a saddle, and a bridle. She did not know how to ride well, but a fierce, desperate resolve gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. She rode west. The journey was a long, punishing trial. The sun beat down on her, and the dust coated her clothes, her hair, her skin. Her muscles screamed in protest. But she did not stop. She rode through the day and into the night, the vast, star-dusted sky her only companion. The emptiness she had felt in her lonely room was gone, replaced by a singular, driving purpose. Every mile brought her closer. Every beat of the horse's hooves on the dry earth was a beat of her own heart, calling his name. She was no longer running from her past. She was riding toward her future. Whatever it might be, she was no longer a victim of the town's judgment, but the agent of her own heart's desire. It was long after midnight when she saw the familiar, dark shapes of the buildings of Dry Creek huddled under the moonlight. The town was asleep, a place of ghosts and bad memories. She did not slow down. She rode straight through the muddy main street, her horse's hooves making soft, sucking sounds. She did not look at the mercantile or the church or her own dark, empty cabin. Her eyes were fixed on one place, the stone jailhouse at the end of the street. A faint, flickering light glowed in the office window. She dismounted, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She tethered the mare to the hitching post and walked on unsteady feet to the door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open, the hinges groaning in the deep silence of the night. The office was empty. The pot-bellied stove was lit, a low fire burning within it, casting a warm, orange glow across the room. Her gaze was drawn to the cell. The door was open, and inside, asleep in a chair pulled close to the warmth of the stove, was Eli. He looked thinner, wearier than she remembered. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was etched with lines of sorrow and solitude. But even in sleep, there was a stillness about him, a sense of peace she had never seen in him before. He was home. This place, this cell, was his home. She took a step into the room, and a floorboard creaked under her weight. His eyes snapped open. For a moment, he was disoriented, looking at her as if she were a ghost, a dream conjured from his own desperate longing. He did not move, did not breathe. He just stared, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, wondrous hope. She saw the question in his eyes, the fear that she was not real, that he was imagining her. She could have spoken, could have told him of her journey, of her unbearable loneliness, of the preacher's words. But no words were necessary. Their story had always lived in the silences between them. He did not speak. He did not rise from his chair. He simply, slowly, raised his hand and reached for her. It was a question, an invitation, a plea. She walked toward him, across the stone floor, into the warm glow of the firelight. She stepped over the threshold, into the cell, as her foot crossed the line from the office into the small, confined space. The heavy iron door, which had been resting precariously ajar, swung slowly on its hinges, closing behind her with a soft, final creak. The sound was not a threat. It was a welcome. She took his outstretched hand. His fingers, warm and calloused, closed around hers, a familiar, grounding pressure. It was the same touch she had felt in the darkness of the storm, a touch that said everything. You are real. You are here. You are home. She knelt before him, still holding his hand, and looked into his eyes. All the pain, all the loneliness of the past weeks dissolved in that single shared gaze. She was no longer a stained woman, and he was no longer a disgraced lawman. They were just Clara and Eli, here in the only place that had ever truly belonged to them. She leaned forward, her voice a raw, breaking whisper, repeating the words that had sealed their fate once before. "Keep me here," she whispered again. "I like it." He brought her hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. A slow smile, the first she had ever truly seen, spread across his face. It was a smile of profound, bone-deep relief, of a man who had been waiting in the wilderness and had finally seen his salvation walking toward him out of the dust. Outside, the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the eastern plains. A single golden ray of sun pierced through the grimy, barred window of the cell. It spilled across the floor, across the two of them, turning the long, dark shadows of the bars into radiant stripes of gold. It was not the light of judgment, but the light of a new day, a new beginning, a promise that even in a cage, a life of profound and beautiful freedom was about to begin. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.